There's an ambiguity in the title of this meeting, Lessons of October, in that the title refers both to the title of Trotsky's little book, Lessons of October, which was published, I think, in September 1924, so very close to the revolution itself. But, of course, it also refers to Trotsky's subject, which is the political lessons of the Russian Revolution of October 1917. I'm very much a pupil of Tony Cliff, who wrote very extensively, particularly about Lenin and the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. And I remember Cliff saying on more than once that the only thing that really matters is the 25th of October 1917. In other words, on that day, there's this extraordinary event in which a successful socialist seizure of power takes place. And even though, as you'll learn later on in this course, it all ended badly and sadly, nevertheless, understanding that event is of immense importance for socialists. And very close to the revolution, Trotsky offers us a very compelling take on some of the key issues there. Of course, he talks about the revolution at much greater length in his greatest work, and one of the very greatest works that any Marxist has produced, his History of the Russian Revolution, which was published in exile in 1930. And I very much, if you one thing to do, one literary thing to do in 2017 should be to read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. You will enjoy it. It will be a treat. It's long, but you'll really enjoy it. Okay, I want to say something about the context of the book. Trotsky wrote this book at the start of the struggle among the leaders of the Bolshevik Party. After Lenin's death, Lenin had died in April 1924, the struggle among the leaders of the Bolshevik Party over the direction the party would take in the years ahead. And again, we know the outcome of all that. The outcome of those struggles was the triumph of Stalin and Trotsky's expulsion both from the Bolshevik Party and from the Soviet Union, and his murder by a Stalinist agent. But at this stage in the inner party struggle, Trotsky is fighting Stalin's main allies, the Bolshevik leaders Zinoviev and Kamenev. And Zinoviev was the president of the Communist International, the international revolutionary movement that the Bolsheviks launched after the revolution. And if you read the pamphlet, you can see that running through it are controversies particularly about what's been happening in Germany. Because between 1918 and 1923, you have this very dramatic revolutionary process in Germany, the overthrow of the Kaiser in November 1918, not just like, or very similar to the overthrow of the Tsar in Russia in February 1917. You have the emergence of a mass communist party, and you have a number of crucial episodes in which the Communist Party is tested and unfortunately fails. In particular, in March 1921, it mounts an absolutely ultra-left attempt to stage an insurrection, which leads to disastrous defeat. And then Trotsky believes, I think rightly, in the autumn of 1923, it let slip an opportunity to have a real German October, to have the victory of a workers' revolution in Germany. And Trotsky is partly, Trotsky writes this partly to state, to generalize from the case of the October Revolution, as he says, but partly to hit Zinoviev where he's vulnerable, because Zinoviev, as leader of the Comintern, was implicated in those different disasters, and there'd been a huge debate, particularly about the March action at the Third Congress of the Communist International in 1921. So this is the kind of backstory that you need to keep in mind in reading it. And Trotsky is pressing the parallels between what happens in Russia in 1917 and what happens in Germany in the early 1920s, partly for reasons to do with the inner party factional struggle. But those parallels are real, and the two revolutions and their fates are intertwined. Crucially, the failure of the German Revolution, creates the conditions, renders definitive the isolation of the Russian Revolution, leading therefore to its ultimately defeat and the rise of Stalin. Okay, what's the focus of Trotsky's text? I would say it's to do, it arises from this. What we see in 1917 between February and October are two interconnected processes. First of all, there's the situation, as Lenin calls it, of dual power, the coexistence of two centres of political power. The provisional government, cobbled together after the fall of the Tsar, a coalition of the kind of more palatable parties of the old regime with the more right-wing parties of the left, the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, and so on, coexisting with the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers, deputies that emerge in the revolutionary process. Two centres of power. Who's going to win out? Secondly, there's the struggle among the left parties. In other words, the struggle for influence in the masses and in the Soviets between the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, and the Bolsheviks in particular. These two processes are interconnected. When the Bolsheviks win the majority in the Soviets, then the provisional government is toast. In other words, then the situation of dual power will be resolved through the Soviets taking power. But there's absolutely nothing inevitable about this. And what Trotsky is talking about in the Lessons of October is a series of critical choices that the Bolshevik Party had to make at key junctures. And he takes this phrase of Lenin's that I'm going to come back to, of the way in which, particularly in revolutionary periods, there are sharp turns in history. And when there's a sharp turn in history in the objective situation, the Revolutionary Party has to turn itself. It has to shift its strategy and tactics. But although Trotsky, I don't think, uses the word, in making those turns or facing up to the choices implied in the sharp turn in history, the Revolutionary Party has to fight with its own conservatism, its own inertia, its own investment in past analysis and tactics. And this is really what Trotsky is talking about. So first of all, February 1917. Mass movement from below and internal decay destroys the Romanov monarchy, and you have the formation of the provisional government. The provisional government wins the support of the Soviets because the Soviets are dominated by the more moderate leftist parties, if you like, the reformists. Trotsky calls them the conciliators, and the crucial substance of the conciliation is business as usual. In other words, that the provisional government is allowed by the Soviet parties to carry on on the one hand, above all in waging the war in alliance with Britain and France against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, no change in Russian society. In particular, nothing to resolve the land question, which affects the lives of the vast majority of the population, the peasants. The Bolsheviks, confronted with this unexpected turn, simply vacillates and effectively forms the left, the extreme left of the parties in the Soviets that are effectively supporting the provisional government. Here, past theory plays an influence. The Bolsheviks, like virtually all Russian Marxists before 1917, accept a stages theory. In other words, they accept the idea that the overthrow of the Tsar will be a process of bourgeois democratic revolution that will lead to some sort of constitutional republic in Russia and consolidate capitalism in Russia. And only once this process is completed will socialist revolution come onto the agenda. So the idea is the Bolsheviks shouldn't oppose the provisional government because the provisional government, with pressure from the left, will carry out the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Only it isn't. The provisional government doesn't, for example, address the question of the land and so on. And above all, it continues the war. Okay, then we have April 1917. Now, I feel a bit nervous because Kevin Core is here, who's written a very learned article about what happens in April 1917 and all the debates around it, and I think he's going to talk about it in a later session. But I'll just give a sort of snapshot summary. What happens is Lenin returns, and he turns the Bolshevik Party on its head, because he says it's absolutely wrong to support the provisional government. Our orientation should be against the provisional government, and our aim should be to overthrow the provisional government. We should call all power to the Soviets. And when he raises this demand, everyone is shocked. Someone says, at last the throne of Bakunin, the great anarchist leader, which has been left empty for the last 50 years, is being filled. You know, in other words, there's this crazy guy who's come on a train from Switzerland and just wants to smash, burn, maim everything. But there's a profound strategic shift involved here, because what has Lenin been doing in Switzerland? He's been studying imperialism. He's been studying how capitalism is transforming itself through imperialism, of which the war is an expression, and how this creates the conditions everywhere for socialist revolution. So essentially, Lenin's understanding of the global power and transformation of capitalism at the beginning of the 20th century leads him to upend the stages theory. So he polemicizes against those who he calls the old Bolsheviks, and he says, he doesn't say it in so many words, which leads to all sorts of theological arguments, but essentially he says all this stuff about stages and completing the bourgeois democratic revolution, this is bunk. The way society has evolved has rendered this agenda obsolete. We need to reject this and to move on to a new agenda that fits the situation, not just in Russia, but in the world today. So Lenin is seeing what's happening in Russia through the lens of global capitalism and world revolution. And after a bitter fight, and I'll say one thing for the old Bolsheviks. The old Bolsheviks are, in a certain sense, speaking of my generation, people like us, but much better than us. In other words, these are people who've built a revolutionary party in conditions of repression, been through the dress rehearsal of the 1905 revolution, held the party together in periods of repression, stood up against the First World War and so on and so forth. So these are the solid substance of the Bolshevik Party. And now Lenin is coming along and saying all the stuff you've been arguing is old hat. So you can understand the resistance that takes place. And this is what I mean about a party, even a revolutionary party, having to fight with its own conservatism. Now, the bottom line in all this is, Lenin says we shouldn't be agitating to overthrow the provisional government. We are a minority, therefore we have to focus on what he calls patiently explaining. In other words, we have to work to win the majority. But what is the cutting edge of their agitation? The war. The provisional government is continuing the war. The left parties, the conciliators, the reformists, are what Lenin calls defences. In other words, they're going along with continuing the war. We campaign against a government that is continuing the war, and we seek to win the working class to the idea that they must take power through the Soviets and end this situation. Okay, then we come to the July days, because as Trotsky brings out very well in his history of the Russian Revolution, mass consciousness develops unevenly, and some sections of the class move ahead of the majority. I'm not talking about revolutionary parties, I'm talking about sections of the working class. This is true in Petrograd, where you have highly organised metal workers, skilled workers, who've led, in some cases, decades of struggle and a very strong organisation. Plus, you've large numbers of soldiers radicalised by the experience of the war and radicalised by the fact the provisional government is going on with the war. It mounts a big offensive in June 1917. So this is a government that is continuing the slaughter. And the radicalisation in Petrograd leads the local leadership essentially to start agitating for an insurrection. But this is to walk into a trap, because the class as a whole, And let's remember that the working class is a minority in Russia, and we also have to think about the peasantry, the majority of the population, the soldiers in capitals and small towns and at the front, outside Petrograd and so on and so forth. They aren't won to the idea of the overthrow of the provisional government. So this is a very dangerous moment. This is a moment that could have turned out like the March action in Germany in 1921, where the Communist Party nearly destroys itself through carrying out a mad insurrectionist approach. But they managed to avoid that, although there's massive repression. Lenin is denounced as a German agent. Academic historians still continue to echo this denunciation. He has to flee into hiding. Various Bolshevik leaders are arrested and so on. So the situation seems to turn against the Bolsheviks. But then, of course, this is a game with many sides, and we're not simply talking about the divisions in the working class and the debates between different left-wing parties and so on and so forth. We're also talking about the ruling class. We're also talking about the core of I'm not sure theologically how to characterize the Russian state in 1917, but the core of the repressive apparatuses of the state in the sense of the army leadership. And with the repression of the Bolsheviks, they get more confident. And so in August 1917, the commander of the army, General Kornilov, decides we don't need this, this flummery of constitutional leftism. The head of the provisional government, Kerensky, who is nominally a socialist and that kind of thing. Let's get rid of all that stuff and reimpose order. And he begins to advance on the capital. This gives the Bolsheviks the opportunity to reach sections of the working class from which they'd been isolated previously by organizing what becomes later, in many ways, the model of what we know as the United Front. They unite with the conciliators. They unite with Kerensky, who has been repressing them, in order to defeat Kornilov. But they do so not through constitutional methods, but through methods of direct action. Strikes, mutinies, tearing up railway lines, agitation in the army. So in mounting this united front, not only is Kornilov defeated, but the Bolsheviks put themselves in a position to reach deeper and deeper into the working class. And this is a turning point because it's in these conditions where the Bolsheviks begin to place themselves in a situation where they can press to take power. And this is what Lenin argues, the final phase of what Trotsky discusses, argues for in the autumn of 2017. He says the conditions now exist for us to take power. And they exist, in a sense, positively in that, as he analyses later, we're getting the support of the majority of the working class, we're winning majorities in the Soviets. At the same time, we're getting more and more support in the army, which is predominantly made up of peasants. And the peasants, even if they don't like us because we're communists, they prefer us to the other parties because we're the only party who say to the peasants, take the land. The social revolutionaries, supposedly the party of the peasants, the party of the small producer, doesn't say this. What Lenin does is essentially to adopt. I mean, there have been all sorts of debates about what to do with the land before the revolution, socialise it, nationalise it, God knows what else. Lenin just says, we should say to the peasants, take the land, divide it among yourselves, smash the landowning class, break the social base of the Tsarist monarchy forever, and recognise that for you to do this, you need Soviet power in the cities. So this is what creates, in a positive way, the conditions for the revolution. But, or if you like, the completion of the revolution. But Lenin also insists, if we look at what's happening, the Germans are advancing from the West, the economy is disintegrating, the bosses are using what one of them calls the bony hand of hunger, in other words, unemployment and starvation, to try and discipline the working class. If we don't move quickly, the situation will disintegrate and the counter-revolution will triumph. So he campaigns ruthlessly for the Bolsheviks to decide to take power, and is confronted with resistance from the right wing of the Bolshevik leadership, headed by Zinoviev and Kamenev, who actually published an article denouncing the idea of the Bolsheviks seizing power, which of course at length in the Lessons of October Trotsky reminds us about, because this is a way of bashing Zinoviev, his current opponent within the Bolshevik leadership. And there's an argument about, okay, you know, the Bolsheviks and their allies, the left social revolutionaries, end up with a majority in the Congress of Soviets that meets at the end of October 1917. Okay, so there's a consensus. There should be a government based on the Soviets. But what should be the basis of that government? Zinoviev and Kamenev say we should have a broad coalition. All the parties of the left should form that coalition. So in other words, this means a coalition with the parties that are opposing land reform and are supporting the continuation of the war. This would be essentially the Bolsheviks signing their suicide pact if they were to agree that. Lenin, with the increasing support of Trotsky, who is in a crucial position as the president of the Petrograd Soviet and the head of the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, which is like the executive arm, argue that no, there has to be a narrow coalition, just with the left social revolutionaries who are against the war and for seizing the land. There's also an argument which Trotsky talks a lot about around how to link the insurrection to the Soviet Congress. In the period of repression, after the July days, Lenin's argued we should no longer argue for all power to the Soviets because the Soviets are dominated by right-wing parties who are acting as instruments of counter-revolution. And his initial instinct is that the Bolshevik Party itself should seize power. Trotsky opposes him in this because he says it's essential to be able to demonstrate the legitimacy of the revolution through its support by the Soviets. And in the end, there's this formula that they use, which is it's necessary to overthrow Kerensky to defend the Soviets against the provisional government and its right-wing allies in the army. And this is what essentially happens. The other thing to emphasize, the point that Trotsky makes, is that the revolution in Petrograd was virtually bloodless. You know, I don't know whether it's true, but people always claim that Eisenstein's film October, made of the revolution in the 1920s, involved more deaths than the actual rising in Petrograd. As I say, I don't know whether it's true, but it sounds good. But in Moscow, the Bolshevik leadership was much more conciliatory, less ruthless, less determined. There was much more bloodshed there. Although, you know, by the scale of, let's say, what's happening in Syria, comparatively little. So that's an important lesson. If you're determined and ruthless, you actually save lives. Okay. I just want now to move towards some general concluding points. What comes out of this whole experience is interpreted by Trotsky. First of all, the very subtle interplay between party and class. You know, sometimes, and this is what we think is the kind of norm, the party is ahead of the class. You know, we're revolutionaries, the mass of workers aren't, we're constrained and restrained by the gap between our revolutionary ideas and the mass of the working class. But this isn't necessarily so. In July 1917, a section of the class, the most militant section in St. Petersburg, in Petrograd, is ahead of the Revolutionary Party, or the bulk of the Revolutionary Party. But you can have a situation in which the class as a whole is ahead of the party. And this is one of the things that worries Lenin in the autumn of 1917, that the masses are ready for the overthrow of the provisional government. And that if the Bolsheviks don't move quickly, either you'll have repeats of the July days with possibly similar lack of success, or you'll have a growing demoralization among the mass of the class. This leads to a second point, which is the importance of rejecting passive fatalism. This is one of the things that Trotsky says repeatedly. And this, I think, relates to this emphasis in Lenin on sharp turns in history. If you look at Lenin's writings in 1917, constantly he talks about sharp turns in history. In other words, history isn't just a steady, linear, forward movement in which organically the forces of socialism become stronger and stronger. No, because capitalism is a system riven with contradictions, crisis, war, class struggle, conflicts between states, all those kinds of things, you can have sudden breaks in the situation. We should know that. You know, think of the political upheavals of the last year or so. Those are who anticipated the world of Brexit and Trump. Those are examples, and the sharp turns that Lenin is talking about, much sharper. The outbreak of the First World War, the fall of the Tsarist regime, and so on and so forth. And it's reminiscent of something that was written later by the German Marxist Walter Benjamin, where he says nothing corrupted German social democracy more than the idea that they were moving with the tide of history. That implies a passive waiting on events favouring you. But if you wait too long, then you'll find that you're at the bottom, that it's the counter-revolutionary forces that seize the situation and crush you. I think then there's an important element, the orientation on the whole of the working class. This is the significance of Lenin talking about patiently explaining. Okay, we understand the necessity of the Soviets taking power. Doesn't mean the mass of workers do. We have to work to win the majority of the working class. This is the necessary condition of Soviet power, winning the majority. The United Front, or what later becomes the United Front, is an instrument for achieving this. But I think it's important to say also, because sometimes the United Front becomes a kind of a religion, you know, that we constantly genuflect to. The United Front doesn't mean the subordination of the Revolutionary Party to the forces we work with. You know, the Revolutionary Party, as someone put it in the context of the Chinese Revolution, isn't there to do slave labour for the parties to our right. We fight for our own politics and our own interests, and we fight for the interests of the whole class, and we're not prepared to see ourselves subordinated to those other forces. Unity is on condition that it strengthens the class, not that we should simply sacrifice to the benefit of others. The final point is that the bigger and more influential the party becomes, the more the divisions inside the class are reflected in it, and the more those divisions can paralyze it. And there's a great passage where Trotsky says this. He says, "A revolutionary party is subjected to the pressure of other political forces. At every given stage of its development, the party elaborates its own methods of counteracting and resisting this pressure. During a tactical turn and the resulting internal regroupments and frictions, the party's power of resistance becomes weakened. From this, the possibility always arises that the internal groupings in the party, which originate from the necessity of a turn in tactics, may develop far beyond the original controversial points of departure and serve as a support for various class tendencies. To put the case more plainly, the party that does not keep in step with the historical tasks of its own class becomes or runs the risk of becoming the indirect tool of other classes." And Trotsky goes on to say, you know, this is true of tactical turns, but the problem is all the greater when you're talking about a strategic turn. In fact, in a revolutionary situation like Russia in 1917, it's hard to distinguish the two. When you try to decide your tactics at an immediate instant, when power is in question, then you're also making strategic choices as well, and you will have arguments inside the party that reflect the pressure of external class forces, but which also are often embodied in the conservatism, the attachment to past tactics, the attachment to part analyses of the party's activists, which, as I say, can be for really good reasons. these traditions have developed for a reason and have allowed the party to hold together and have an influence. But then comes the moment when the tradition has to be broken. Not, as people sometimes say about Lenin, out of a kind of empty pragmatism. It's just a matter of manoeuvring this way and that, but because to advance the interests of the revolutionary struggle and to get to that moment of 25th of October 1917, you need to shift, you need to break, you need to overcome your own conservatism. Obviously, that means political leadership is tremendously important. And the reason why, if you read Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, Lenin figures so prominently is because he, more than anyone else, offered that ingredient of leadership in the situation. Doesn't mean he was always right. I mean, it's clear the argument over whether to tie the insurrection to the meeting of the Second Congress of Soviets at the end of October 1917, he was wrong and Trotsky was right. I mean, there were other things he was mistaken about in 1917. So it isn't like anyone saying Lenin is God, Lenin knew everything, and so on. But Lenin played an indispensable role, and political leadership is more necessary in a revolutionary situation than in any other circumstances. So a revolution involves not just a fight with the old regime, a fight with the reformist forces and so on and so forth. It involves the party fighting with itself in order to make itself adequate to what Trotsky calls the tasks of history.